What few sources I could locate about German fantasy illustrator Franz Stassen were wildly contradictory about dates of publication, so in terms of his career I've generally had to give up on the usual chronological approach. He was born in 1869 in Hanau, and from 1886 onward he spent a total of 6 years at the Berlin College of Fine Arts. One source asserts it was 1899 when he illustrated the 12th century love story of Tristan and Isolde. I have serious doubts that this is accurate, but I've got to start somewhere. In whatever year it was actually published, this collection of 12 illustrations blended two major stylistic influences. There was the sinuous organic appeal of Art Nouveau, known as Jugendstil in Germany, and there was also the more formal influence of early 19th century engravings evident. In 1908, Stassen became a member of the circle of like-minded individuals gathered around composer Richard Wagner's son Siegfried. He and his friends were dedicated to the preservation and performance of his father's dramatic operatic works. Stassen was rightly considered the perfect choice to illustrate the Nordic mythology that was at the thematic heart of all Wagner's music. And in the years that followed he created numerous portfolios, illustrating many of Wagner's emotionally charged operas. It's asserted that these images were created as hand-tinted lithographs, and I see no reason to dispute that. Time-consuming as that process would have been, these books were never intended for mass consumption, but were limited edition collector's items for Wagner's devoted admirers, and they would have fetched high prices. So from 1908 up to 1920 or so, Stassen devoted himself to the visualization of the narratives which were the dramatic mythological basis of the musical compositions. There are 3 different years cited for the publication of the Brothers Grimm tale of the Seven Ravens, but whenever they were created this was another significant series of narrative illustrations, this time apparently created as pen and ink with watercolour and printed by full-colour mechanical lithography. Consequently, these images have a much more modern, almost comic book appeal. It seems relatively certain that Hans von Walsigen's mythological tale Die Edda was published in 1920. It featured around 50 linear illustrations created with carefully controlled pen and ink. Once again, I can't find reliable dates, but throughout his career he also created a large amount of illustration for Johann Goethe's epic tale of Faust. Quite a lot of these images were created with watercolour, but unlike the Seven Ravens work, they were not colourised monochrome drawings, but fully rendered paintings. There were also even more black and white pen drawings produced, and the work was published spasmodically in instalments. Naturally enough, Adolf Hitler was a great admirer of Stassen's work, and in the 1930s he commissioned 4 huge tapestries, in which Stassen revisited the story of Die Edda, to be hung on the walls of the Reich Chancellery. Sadly, they were destroyed in the last days of the war, along with many of his paintings, when the Allies bombarded Berlin. After the war, Stassen attempted without much success to recreate the public art of his which had been destroyed. He also resumed work on his Faust epic, and he was still creating illustrations for it when he died in 1949 in Berlin at the age of 80. John R. Neill was born in Philadelphia in 1877, and in his late teens he enrolled into the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. But he quit after only 1 semester, and after a couple of years of unchallenging work for a local department store, in 1898 he was hired as a staff artist at the Philadelphia North American newspaper. The comic strips and illustrated features he created there were at least a beginning, but they barely hinted at the illustrator he would become. By 1904 he was also illustrating books for children, and most significantly in that year he was approached by L. Frank Baum's publishers to illustrate The Marvelous Land of Oz, a follow-up to Baum's stupendously successful Wizard of Oz. Baum and Oz's original illustrator, William Denslow, had parted after a bitter dispute over copyright and royalties, and he needed a more amenable replacement. Neill's first evocations of the characters stuck fairly closely to the originals, but the new book also featured many entirely new characters he could put his own stamp on. and although not as sensitively rendered as the illustrations would later become, even at this stage his style was less graphically blockish than Denslow's. Despite the immediate success of the book, Neill carried on working for the North American, but he continued to be offered the opportunity to illustrate the many variants on the Oz theme that Baum was churning out, and all of them sold very well. As the series continued, the look of the books became progressively more sensitive and revealed the innate delicacy and expressiveness of Neill's technique in colour and black and white. By this point he was also creating illustration for other books for children and adults, and working for magazines too. In 1910 he illustrated an edition of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Poe's verse was fantasy of an altogether more adult kind, but Neill's melancholic duotone illustrations proved to be a good match for his writing. In 1911 he finally gave up his job at the North American, and 2 years later he moved to New York to be closer to his publishing clients. Although he was essentially a linear illustrator, his use of colour was far from an afterthought, and like many of his contemporaries in Europe and America, he applied washes of watercolour on top of the line rather than create fully fledged paintings. L. Frank Baum died in 1919, but the Oz franchise rolled on successfully and was now written by Ruth Plumley Thompson. And naturally they continued to be illustrated by Neill, whose work had by now become the definitive images for the series, and he stayed in that role for another couple of decades. Eventually he became both writer and illustrator, with a trio of Oz adventures all published between 1940 to 1942. But he'd been having heart problems since the later 1930s, and they proved to be fatal in 1943, when he was only 65 years old. If you want to see more of Neill's work, there are around 30 complete books illustrated by him, which can be downloaded free at Project Gutenberg. Although he was born in Lisbon in 1888, Americo Nunez was actually half Portuguese and half German, and he was published in both countries during his career. In 1906, at the age of 18, he left Lisbon for Paris. Whether he studied there or just had a good time isn't recorded, but he stayed there until 1911 before moving on to Munich. There he quickly became a regular contributor to the German satirical magazine Meggendorfer Blatter, and his association with this widely read magazine did his career a lot of good. When war was declared in 1914, Nunes left for Zurich in Switzerland, a country which remained neutral throughout the conflict. But from Zurich he continued to contribute to Meggendorfer and turned his talents to propagandist work in support of Germany and attacking the Allies and their leaders. He returned to Portugal when the war was over, and from there he not only carried on his association with Meggendorfer, but he also began contributing to the magazine's rival Fliegende-Blatter. Although Nunes was considered primarily to be a cartoonist, he frequently created images in other more serious styles, from languid Art Deco figures to more directly representational romanticised approaches. He also seems to have been eclectic in his use of media. As you would expect, his line work was created with pen and ink, and although once again he happily moved back and forth between the comic and the serious, it was always highly controlled and visually absorbing. It was a similar story with his use of colour. Some of the time he applied gouache flat with well-chosen colour palettes, but he was also adept with varying levels of tonal application of both watercolour and gouache. And as was the common practice of the day, quite often his work was created as line and then coloured with flat printed overlays. From every conceivable angle, Nunes was one of the most stylistically diverse illustrators of his generation. In the 1920s and 30s, his illustration career was flourishing, and by this point he was also being regularly commissioned by several Portuguese and Spanish magazines. The demise of Meggendorfer Blatter in 1927 did leave somewhat of a hole in his regular client base, but he continued working for his other European magazine clients, and he also ventured into children's book illustration, where he demonstrated an obvious talent for narrative work, with some particularly engaging and amusing line and flat colour illustrations. As if that wasn't enough, there was also occasional work for advertising, although it was magazine illustration which continued to dominate his output. By now he was one of the most successful and widely published illustrators in Europe, but in his later life he seems to have lost interest in commercial illustration, and he became increasingly involved in promoting the art of Portugal, travelling across Europe and America as a roving ambassador. And he continued to paint with some success up to his death in Portugal in 1968 at the age of 80. I'm glad to say that in Portugal at least, Nunes is still recognised and admired as one of the most influential modernist Portuguese illustrators. Hungarian illustrator Tibor Gurgley was born in Budapest in 1900, and other than that there's only very sketchy biographical information. He studied lithography in Vienna and also worked for a Viennese puppet theatre as a set and model designer, before returning to Budapest in 1931 to teach art and design. But it wasn't until 1939, when he was already 40 years old, that he and his wife emigrated to New York, and he started to work as a commercial illustrator. In 1940 he illustrated his first children's book, The Talking Typewriter, which had been written by Margaret Pratt, and the success of the book led him to work on many others for the rest of his career. In the same year he collaborated with the writer George Duplay, and together they created the book The Topsy-Turvy Circus, which was another popular success. He had also created a handful of covers for The New Yorker, which had helped to boost his public profile. But as luck would have it, a couple of years later, George Duplay became a partner in the publishing company Little Golden Books. And through his association with Duplay, Gergely immediately became a permanent contributor to many of the books published by the company in the coming decades. The first was Tootle the Train in 1945, and he followed this up a year later with Scuffy the Tugboat. Gergely's playful blend of folk art and modernism fit in particularly well with the fashion of the times, and Golden Books soon came to dominate the children's book market in America throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The images were painted, but with deliberate naivety, and careful observation collided with abstraction and skewed perspectives to give all his work an undeniable and appealing energy. There weren't that many times that Gergely created monochrome illustration, but when he did, he used an ink line with roughly shaded crayon. And when it came to colour, he painted in gouache, using a combination of flat and rough tonal application. And on occasion it looks very much like he was shading with pencil or crayon in the colour work too. In his career, Gergely created far too many books to show them all, but many of them, such as The Happy Man and His Dump Truck, continue to feature motorised vehicles of one sort or another. Watch Me Said the Jeep was published in 1945, and another of his greatest successes, The Fire Engine book, appeared in 1950. And for the next 2 decades all his illustration continued to display the same upbeat visual appeal, and a natural talent for composition and narrative sequencing. In 1974, after an astonishingly prolific 35-year career, Tibor Gurgley retired, and he died in New York 4 years later at the age of 78. And that's another 4 off my bucket list, and I hope to see you next time.